In the meantime, you can go to your Jupyter Hub and load up the notebook that we'll be using, which is actually going to be the second out of 6. So if you go to Tuesday Machine Learning, don't start up 01. I mean, you can if you want, but we'll actually spend most, if not all of our time in this second one here, 02, Core Concepts. So you can load that if you want. And I think probably everyone should be straightened out by now, but if not, if you didn't watch any of the morning lectures, be aware that instructors are updating the repository that the Jupyter Hub is synced with fairly often. And so the material for this particular presentation was uploaded this morning. And so if you opened your Jupyter Hub and you didn't find a Tuesday Machine Learning folder, then probably what you need to do is restart your hub. And note that logging out will not help. You'll need to actually go, so if you go to File and then Hub Control Panel, you can stop my server and then start it. Alternatively, you could pull from Git directly. And I think somebody pasted the command to do that in one of the channels. But probably the fastest thing at this point is to just restart your hub if you need to. If you see the materials there, you're fine. So just to reiterate, I guess we'll start now. People who didn't catch the first part of that, we're in the Tuesday Machine Learning folder, but we're using we're going to spend most of our time in the Core Concepts #2 notebook and not #1. This is a 6-part tutorial. We're not going to get through 6 parts. We're probably not even going to get through 1. Which is fine. They're long and fairly detailed, so feel free, if you want, afterwards you can explore them in much more detail. I should mention that this is, I should sort of give you a little bit of the lay of the land. We have a lot of machine learning content in the next 3 days. So this is meant to be really sort of a high-level overview and just very basic introduction to core concepts in scikit-learn, to core concepts in machine learning and the basic interface of scikit-learn. If you've been working for several years in scikit-learn, you're probably not going to get a whole lot of benefit from this tutorial. So, I mean, obviously I'm happy to have you, but don't feel compelled to stick around. You can skim the content and see if there's stuff that you think you don't already know. If you're new to machine learning, then you're probably in the right place. And certainly if you haven't touched scikit-learn at all or only just started, then hopefully you'll actually get quite a bit out of this. So I'll just launch you through. I probably, in the interest of time, also won't take a long break. I might take like a 2-minute bathroom break in the middle, but it's not a lot of time. In the past, I've had, in the past, I think I've done like 3 hours of this, and so an hour and a half is, it'll be interesting. Feel free to ask questions at any point. I'll try to monitor the Q&A. So one more time, just because I see people are still showing up, we're looking at the second notebook in the Tuesday Machine Learning folder, not #1, #2. The first notebook contains some preliminaries. If you find the second one we'll go through helpful, then I would suggest going back and maybe skimming at least the first one. It's mostly just walks you through like who this is targeted at, the organization, what software you need, which you all already have if you're on the hub, and then much more detail about the Abide2 data set we'll use. So in the interest of time, I won't really talk much about any of those things, but you're welcome to go and work through that notebook afterwards. So what we'll be talking about today is mostly core concepts in machine learning. And then we'll talk about the actual application to some imaging data in scikit-learn. So as always, assuming you're following along and you're staring at my, my Jupyter Lab, my Jupyter Hub in the browser, we'll start by running this cell just to import all the things we'll need. And then putting them all at the top, except for all the scikit-learn stuff, which we'll import piece by piece, just so you can see where it's coming from. But so here we have a bunch of things you've probably already seen to some degree: NumPy, Pandas, Matplotlib, which Kirsty Whitaker, I think, is talking about right now in the session opposite this. I won't talk about plotting, so if this is new to you, then please do watch her talk afterwards when it's posted on YouTube. And then there's a custom plotting function I'm importing here, which you don't need to worry about. It's just there's a particular brain plot I'm generating. So, but the code is there in the support folder should you want to look at it. Okay, so let's start with the very basic definitions. What is machine learning? Why is machine learning so popular at the moment? What's so special about machine learning? It's a broad field. There's lots of ways to define it. A definition I like is machine learning is the field of science or engineering that seeks to build systems capable of learning from experience. And there's many ways to unpack that. I'll draw attention to two particular elements that I think are common to most applications. One is that the emphasis is on developing algorithms that can learn semi-autonomously from data. So you can contrast that with static rule-based systems that are explicitly designed or updated by humans, right? Where the details of the rule are sort of predetermined. Right? It's like, if you see this observation, do this thing. Sort of like you can imagine a long series of conditional statements or something, right? Where it's just the rule is fixed. And so in machine learning, the idea is to develop algorithms. They're not sort of, we're not talking about like, artificial general intelligence. It's not like they're like figuring out what the goals are for the environment, et cetera. But the idea is that there's some freedom the algorithm has to improve itself in some way, or to learn certain parameters that produce desirable outcomes. And the other major aspect of this is that algorithm evaluation tends to focus heavily on the ability to meet objective quantitative targets. So the emphasis really is on predicting outcomes that we want to achieve. And one way to understand that is to contrast it with traditional scientific inference, where at least part of the goal, but probably the primary goal really, is to understand or explain how a system operates. And these are not mutually exclusive. I'm not saying you're doing prediction or explanation, but not both. But most people tend to favor one over the other to some extent. You can figure out where in the continuum you are. And just as a rough generalization, people in machine learning tend to be much more interested in figuring out how to make good predictions than in arriving at sort of a quote unquote true, or at least approximately correct model of the data generating process. So it's roughly the difference between saying, I want to know how, let's say, the brain actually does it, right? How does that work? Versus, I don't really care how the brain per se does it. I just want a model that can generate behavior that I think is useful. And if that requires something that looks brain-like, great. But if you can do that with some artificial network that's nothing like the brain, that's fine too, right? So those are different orientations. Although there is certainly an overlap, and not saying you do one or the other. Like you can do, one sometimes and the other times, etc. And we don't need to take a principled position here on like which of these is better or even how they interface. I've linked to several papers on this topic, one of which I wrote. Just be aware that we're assuming for purposes of this tutorial that our goal is good prediction. So there won't be much, I will say here. Parts of the notebooks I won't get to do talk about interpretation and implications of certain things, but probably won't touch on that much here. Okay, so for the next, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes, we'll just explore some major distinctions in machine learning. So really basic concepts that many of you may have encountered, but some of you might have heard the terms and not really gotten clear on what they mean. So hopefully we'll make that a little clearer. So the first really important distinction is between supervised and unsupervised learning. And broadly speaking, you can carve up almost all of the space of machine learning into one of these two forms of learning. And learning is supervised, we say, when we know the ground truth that our model is trying to predict. So the idea is that, why is it supervised? Well, because you can imagine sort of the model is trying to produce an answer, but you're there to supervise it because you know what the answer should be. And so you're able to actually feed it the sort of the correct labels and make iterative adjustments. You can quantify the degree of error between the prediction versus the target. So the idea is that in supervised learning, we know the ground truth. We have the answer already. And so a good example of that is ordinary least squares regression, which many of you, maybe most of you probably have worked with, right? Just linear regression. And that is actually, you might not think of it as machine learning, but it is actually a form of supervised learning if it's applied to make predictions. It takes inputs as predictors and also labels the outcome that you're trying to predict. Right? And so in science, we often call these the predictors, or I should say the features, which is the term people use in machine learning. And in various sciences, people might call these variables or predictors, but they're essentially the same meaning as features. And similarly, we'll talk about labels or targets in this tutorial, but that means basically the same as like outcome variable or dependent variable. Okay, so for first approximation, you can substitute those terms and you'll be fine. The nice thing about that is if you've done linear regression before, congratulations, you are actually a machine learning researcher. You may not have realized it, right? So that's cool. Some examples of supervised learning problems. The first one in this list we'll actually attempt. So predicting people's chronological age from structural brain differences. Supervised problem. You have a data set, you know the age, you have brain features. You can train a model to try and recover those features. Deciding whether or not incoming email is spam, right? The outcome is known. You have a training data set at least. You know for every email that's labeled spam or not spam. Predicting a person's rating of a particular movie based on their ratings of other movies. Diagnosing schizophrenia based on genetic markers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots and lots and lots of supervised learning problems out in the world that we engage with on a regular basis in pretty much every domain of science. So I'll talk about, well, let me just anticipate, but not supervised learning, we don't have any labels, right? So we're trying to find structure in the data. I'll talk about that in a moment. But let's sort of look further at two major distinctions within supervised learning. Here, the difference is between classification problems and regression problems. And really the only difference is the nature of the labels you're trying to predict. In classification, the labels are discrete, and in regression, they're continuous. And that's basically the only difference. So we have a regression problem anytime we have a set of continuous labels, continuous numerical labels, and we're using the features to predict the quantity, right? So it's not just like, is this the value blue or yellow? It's like, how old is the person? How much does this thing weigh, et cetera. So there's a continuous variable we're trying to predict. And so you've all seen regression problems. Linear regression, for instance, is obviously an instance of regression. So here's a scatter plot. And I should mention there's a lot of these cells that generate plots. I'm just I figured rather than just show you static images, I may as well show you the Python code that generates the figures, but I won't talk about it all. You're free to explore it, but for our purposes, I'm just going to treat it as like they're static figures and just take the content as given instead of walking through the code. So here's a scatter plot, just a simple bivariate plot of these x and y variables. And you might come along and say, well, what's the relationship between these, and how well can we predict the scores along this y-axis if we know the scores on the x? If you know, oh, this data point, the x value is -1, what does that tell you about the standing of this observation on this y dimension, right? So it's a traditional setup for regression. And so one question, of course, you have to ask, like, what do you mean? Like, what would a good prediction be? Like, what is the metric you're using to determine that? And one way to operationalize that, a very common one, is in terms of the least squares criteria. So ordinary least squares defines a good fit, or the optimal fit, as one that minimizes the sum of squares between the observed values and the predicted values, right? So, for example, this line here, which is the OLS best fit line, is the arrangement of that line, right, that minimizes the sum of squares from that line to each of these individual points. And the predictions are given by the line. So if I know that x value is 1, I just read off this point what the prediction is on the y-axis. That's a regression problem. Classification, essentially the same thing. Superficially, it doesn't look like the same thing, but really the only difference is that the outcome now is discrete. So in the simplest case, you have two classes. So here's a plot of what that might look like. Someone hands you this particular data, and the colors denote the labels. So these are two classes, right? So there's one type of observation, and that's colored in purple, and the other is in yellow. And it looks like this. And your job is to correctly classify the samples, right? It's to come up with some algorithm or rule, or ideally learning rule, that given new data like this, can identify the correct labels. So if I handed you some more data points, but this time they didn't have the colors attached, the labels, would you be able, based on their position in this case, two-dimensional space, would you be able to do a good job assigning the labels? And so this, for example, is a super easy classification problem, right? It's linearly separable, so you could just put a line in between these things, and that would perfectly discriminate between the observations in this class and the ones in this class. Typical problems are not going to look this simple. And also here's what maybe a more realistic problem might look like. And so now you can see there is some separation, right? Like but there's also overlap. And so if you try to think about, like, well, what would a good way to separate as well as you can between these two classes be? You start to think about really, so there's no limit to the sort of sophistication you could come up with, right? There's all kinds of ways you could try to craft a decision boundary between these points that would capture, would sort of separate, like try to get as many of the purple points on one side of the boundary and as many of the yellow ones on the other. And it might not be possible to do a perfect job. In the real world, often it's not. Right? It's not, given the data you have, you cannot actually build a perfect classifier, just like you can't often build a perfect regressor. The question is, how well can you do? There's a question. Oh, that's solved analytically. The question is, how does that function particularly obtain the minimum? That's just using the least square solver in NumPy. You could obtain it in many ways. I mean, the point here is not really to talk about not making any points about the solver here, just to illustrate least squares solution. Okay, and also the outcome doesn't have to be binary. So in this case, you can see an example where we have, I think, like five different classes, right? So someone might hand you this data and say, here's some training data, and they're labeled, so you know which classes each point belong to. But expect that you could be handed new data where you wouldn't know the label. So now you have to decide, is this class 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Right? So that's called multi-class classification, where there's multiple classes. But that's really in terms of the sort of the framing. I mean, the algorithms used to solve these problems can be quite different, but that's really all there is to the fundamental problem. Right? It's that simple. So supervised learning, you have X's and Y's, you have some features and something you're trying to predict that you know the ground truth. And the difference between regression classification is just whether you have a continuous outcome or a discrete outcome. Okay, what about unsupervised learning? In unsupervised learning, we don't know the ground truth. So someone hands you a data set, and it might have a bunch of columns in it, a bunch of features, variables, but there's no outcome here. There's no labels. And so what can you do with that? Well, obviously you can't try to come up with a good prediction because there is no target. You're not trying to predict anything. So when you think about it, is your goal in unsupervised learning is just to find useful or interesting structure in the data. What counts as interesting is entirely up to you. It depends on what you care about, what your goal is, how you think you might use the structure you discover down the line. The common denominator really is just that there's, at least at the time at which you're training the algorithm, there's no wrong or right way. I mean, you don't have access to that, at least, right? There could be a ground truth, but you don't know it. So best you can do is to try to find structure that seems like it makes sense in some way. And again, broadly speaking, we can distinguish between two classes of unsupervised learning applications. There's clustering, where our goal is to label the samples we have, typically, well, not typically, but like, let's say we have a data set of like scans from 1,000 people. We might want to cluster those people into clusters, which is to say, we want to identify similarities between them and determine that, this set of people looks similar to one another. There's some sensible categorization, and we treat them as like a discrete type or group or cluster from this other set over here. And best case scenario would be something like this. Someone hands you data like this. Notice now we don't know the classes. There's no color. Right? These all have the same color. So in some sense, we don't know what the truth is here. However, I submit that if someone handed you this kind of data and asked you to come up with some sensible clustering, you wouldn't have to think very, very hard about it before you said, obviously there's 3 clusters, and you would label them like this, right? And if you didn't do that, like if you decided, oh, maybe these 2 points over here should be labeled yellow, you would probably get funny looks from the person who handed you the data. This is a case where it's like, how else could you possibly structure these things? It just seems obvious. But just like we don't get super clean classification or regression problems in the real world, we generally don't get super clean clustering problems. You wouldn't really need an algorithm if you were handed things like this, right? You could just you could tell at a glance. So here's some maybe slightly more realistic data. So on the left this is simulated, right? So we know the ground truth. The ground truth is on the left, and we have 3 classes now. And if you look at it knowing the ground truth, notice this is actually still a pretty easy classification problem. You can separate these things with like one line going down there, one going here across, and you're probably like 98% accurate on these data at least. So it seems like a super easy problem if you have the labels. But imagine somebody handed you this data on the right, and you don't have the labels, right? it's actually not at all clear if you maybe cover the left panel and look at it. It's not that obvious that there are where the boundaries between clusters are. And in fact, it's not even obvious how many clusters there are. You might look at that and see, well, oh, you know what? It looks like there's one cluster here, maybe another one here, another one here, another one here. So 4 clusters, right? Or you might think, actually, this is not really data amenable to a clustering application. It looks to me like this is just like a bivariate normal distribution, right? Both of these axes are essentially just drawn from a normal distribution, and it's noise. And why are you asking me to cluster this? Well, in this case, we know there is a ground truth, and it looks like this, but you wouldn't know that typically. And this is, I think, a humbling observation that I try to like run simulations like this for myself once in a while, because it kind of keeps you grounded, right? Like in the real world, you'll get data like this, and you'll run a clustering algorithm, and it might give you something like this on the left, but you have no way generally of knowing if that's actually a good approximation of the true data generating process, right? And so you want to be very aware that clustering algorithms will always work in the sense that they'll give you an answer. Very few of them have like some stopping rule that says, sorry, I can't. And so you'll get an answer and it might look good, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're onto sort of like real structure in some sense. The other kind of unsupervised method or application is dimensionality reduction. And here we're generally operating on the features, not on the samples. We're not clustering like people or objects into discrete groups. The idea is just to reduce the size of our data set in some way. So you might have a data set with 1 million features. Think of the brain, right? Maybe you have a data set and you have people in rows and voxels in columns. And you might have 200,000 voxels. Well, do all those voxels carry independent information? Like, do you really need a model that has 200,000 variables in it? Maybe, but you need a lot of observations for reasons we'll talk about. You'll need a lot of data to be able to actually fit that model reasonably well. Or you need certain kinds of algorithms that can handle that kind of data. And you might think, look, there's really no point to having that much data or that many features because there's a lot of redundancy, right? We can reduce that to some smaller number of variables that carry most of the information, in which case we have just a much easier problem to solve from an estimation standpoint. Our model is probably going to be able to learn more easily from 100 features than it will from 200,000 features, as long as we feel like we're getting most of the information. And so just to give you sort of a toy example, if you ever see something like this, this is data set that's nominally in 2 dimensions, right? Like if someone handed you this data set, it would have, let's say, an X variable and a Y variable. But as soon as you plot them or run a correlation, you quickly realize there's really only like one axis of variation here, right? Like the first axis, if you were to do a PCA, a principal component analysis, which we won't talk about, but it is covered in the 6th notebook in a series, then you would lay down one dimension. I should probably have plotted this. You would lay down an axis basically running this way, and once you account for that, the remaining, the sort of, if you move in the perpendicular orthogonal direction, there's just not much variation left, right? And so with very little loss, these variables are probably correlated like 0.95 or something. With very little loss, you could throw away one of these variables and just have one. And so now you've halved the number of features, right? So that seems like a fairly sensible thing to do, especially as you have, when you have very large feature sets. Okay, so that's just conceptually like the very broad, high-level sort of review of some major distinctions in applications in machine learning. And now what we'll do is we'll talk about some data, and then we'll actually go through an application of each of those kinds of problems and actually analyze some real data. So to do that, what I've done is I've obtained some data from the Abide 2 project. I won't spend much time explaining this just because it will take time. And as I mentioned in this data set here, I go into much more detail about like where the data came from, how I extracted, et cetera. So, but just the short of it is, this is a large multi-site project, an imaging project that I think for some like 17 sites is collected. And there's actually 2 projects. Over 1,000 structural scans. Actually, there's functional data too. We'll just look at the structural data. MRI scans of people with autism and controls running across the lifespan. So from ages, I think, like 5 to like 70 or something. And so if we read this in with pandas and just show the first 5 rows, I've only kept the variables that I'm going to work with here, the original data sets you can find online, they're freely available, which is part of the reason I was able to use this actually. So it's yay, free data and open data. And so let me just highlight a couple of variables. One is the age. We'll be using that. This is the age in, I'm guessing it's like fractions of years too, but it's the age in years. Sex, actually sex we're not going to talk about, but you can figure out what that is. Group is, one is autism, two is control. So we will also do a classification problem on that. After that, the rest of that, notice there's 1,440 more variables after the first 6. Those are all features extracted from or using FreeSurfer. And I didn't do the extraction, actually. Someone on Twitter pointed me to, I credited them appropriately here. So another kind of nice example of how, ask and you shall receive on social media, because I really did not want to spend a lot of time extracting features from 1,200 or 1,100 brains. But the nice thing here is these are all, so there's 4 sets of FreeSurfer features, and there's surface area, volume, cortical thickness, and local gyrification for each of 360 ROIs in the Human Connectome Project's MP1 parcellation, aka the Glasser et al. Atlas. That parcellation you've probably seen before looks roughly like this. Please don't tell anyone in HCP land that I'm showing you this projected onto a volumetric representation. We're not going to do any analysis beyond this. I just want to show you what the clusters or the parcels look like roughly, right? So each color is a different parcel. So we're slicing up the brain essentially. I mean, this is its own form of dimensionality reduction already. We've carved up the brain into 360 chunks, and each value here reflects the value for one of those chunks, one of those parcels, for a particular kind of measure extracted with FreeSurfer. There's a question. Why not use the whole nifty image? For demonstration purposes, it just wouldn't fly. We can't have people loading 200,000 by 1,000 arrays, 300 times over. But to be honest, there's not really much. I mean, this is partly what we'll explore. There's not arguably that much point in it for certainly not for just instructional purposes, because you probably aren't going to get a whole lot more out of the voxels, or at least there will be diminishing returns. So conceptually, it doesn't really matter. Of course, if you really wanted to squeeze as much as possible out of it, and if you were certainly using convolutional neural nets or something like that, then absolutely, you want to start with all data, why throw away information? But for purposes of the kinds of algorithms we'll talk about here, and just to make the conceptual point, it really doesn't matter. And so it's helpful to do dimensionality reduction. How about nifty plus PCA? Sure, you could. I mean, the point here is well, I should also mention that these come out of FreeSurfer already parcellated, right? So some metrics you couldn't what is the volume of a cluster? That doesn't make sense at a voxel level. Right? That's by definition a cluster level thing. Sure, you could start with just the raw image and then extract all kinds of information from it with PCA, et cetera. Again, I should probably emphasize, this is meant for, I'm trying to convey the concepts and the tools. Nothing about this should be interpreted as this is the optimal way to predict, right? So this is not, you can do much, much better than this for many reasons. So these are good questions, but just keep in mind that the goal here is to illustrate how these tools are used and the concepts, and not, if we just wanted the best prediction and we had enough data, we would probably just find a neural network, right? You probably wouldn't necessarily even be looking at these kinds of tools if you had sort of infinite compute and data, right? So it's only because you have sort of limited capacity in various ways that you kind of probably try to use other techniques. Okay, good questions though, and it's good to keep in mind. Nothing I say is a prescriptive suggestion. This is a good way to predict this outcome. All right, so now that we have some data loaded, we can talk about the scikit-learn package. Scikit-learn, you may have heard of, you may have used, is probably the most widely used machine learning package in the world in any language. And it has support for most sort of major classes of machine learning algorithms, the really obvious exception being deep learning. So it doesn't do, I don't think any, but certainly not much deep learning, and there are reasons for that. So you can sort of think of this as vanilla machine learning, and there's sort of the fancy deep learning stuff, which you would probably use TensorFlow or PyTorch for. So I'm not going to touch at all on deep learning, but fortunately, Ariel Rokem will talk about it if he hasn't already. I don't remember when that is. But nevertheless, scikit-learn, particularly for problems that don't involve super highly structured data, where we have a lot of data, the kinds of tools implemented in scikit-learn are generally going to suffice for many applications. And it's a really lovely package for many reasons. One is that it has a simple, elegant interface, which you'll see and hopefully appreciate in a moment. The documentation is just really, really stellar. I think people hold it up as a model for what good documentation should look like. Tons of examples, tons of really detailed user guide. The detailed reference is exceptional. So just many, many reasons to really, really like scikit-learn, one of them being the documentation. And one of the creators of scikit-learn, Tal Yarkoni, will actually give a talk on machine learning applications in neuroimaging on, I think, Thursday. So you can see this is sort of like a very preliminary introduction of some of the concepts, and then Gael will talk in great detail about some particular applications that he's been working on. But you can probably also ask some questions about scikit-learn and why and where and how, etc. Okay, so we know we have some data and we want to use scikit-learn. Let's get the data into scikit-learn. And scikit-learn, like most other packages in the Python ecosystem, scientific ecosystem at least, rely on NumPy internally. So scikit-learn expects to receive as inputs NumPy arrays. And hopefully you're all familiar with NumPy. You may have seen my presentation earlier today. So I won't talk about what NumPy arrays are or their structure at all. We'll just assume that you know what those are. And so the structure to almost all scikit-learn estimators, or sorry, I should say to supervised estimators, right, ones where you're trying to predict a known quantity, it involves two inputs. One is a matrix of features, which conventionally we label X. And the nice thing is that our abide data is already more or less in that format. The only thing is, notice up here, we have the first few features here are probably, they're not brain features, so we probably don't want to include in the prediction. And certainly age is, and what we want is our outcomes. So we would not want to include those in the predictors. So we'll just create a separate variable called x_all, just to denote that we have all the x's, all the features, and later we'll be subsampling from that. So we store all of our features in this data frame. And the other input that scikit-learn's supervised estimators expect is conventionally labeled y, and that's the labels or the targets. And that's just a one-dimensional array or a vector. And here we'll just use age to start with. So we're going to start with the regression problem. And so we're just going to say that the thing we're trying to predict is age. And so our first problem, or an illustration of supervised learning, specifically of regression, is going to be brain age prediction, which again, I don't have time to do any review, but a lot of people in the last few years have become quite interested in whether you can predict chronological age from brain structure and function, with the idea that if you could do that, then you might actually have a measure that's quite useful for potentially clinical applications. For example, as an endophenotype that tells you, oh, this person's brain looks, maybe they're 40, but they have a brain that looks like it's 70, and maybe that has implications for disease progression, etc. But we're not going to worry about interpretation so much. Our goal is just to predict age as well as we can, with the caveat that it's not really as well as we can. It's just passively good, just to illustrate how this works. So the most important thing to know about scikit-learn is that it's structured around the notion of an estimator. So an estimator in statistics is just any rule or device or instrument that can produce an estimate for a quantity you want, right? And that's all it is here. So anything can be an estimator. In previous versions of this, I actually showed how you can write your own estimator that's, even if it's really dumb, it will generate a prediction, right? So anything that gives you an estimate is an estimator. And so the scikit-learn interface is really structured around this idea of estimator classes. And what's critical about this is that any tool or any class that implements or that is supposed to serve as a scikit-learn estimator needs to do certain things. Notably, it needs to implement fit and predict methods. Right? So that's, in a sense, the definition of an estimator in scikit-learn is that it implements these. There's also a little more to it, but basically it implements these methods. If you have an object that can do fit and do predict, then for our purposes at least, you can think of it as a viable estimator. So when we call fit, what we're saying is we're telling the the estimator object to take some training data, which in this case will include the mandatory X matrix, and if it's supervised learning, Y. If it's unsupervised, only the X. So does anybody else often want a problem with hearing? Time to time noise comes in. I don't know if I can do anything about that. If other people are having that problem, I can try moving around, but hopefully that's on your end and not mine. But yeah, I'll just proceed unless I hear that there's other people are having trouble. So we fit the data, and that means that internally the estimator is doing whatever it needs to come up with estimates, right? So that can be really simple, that can be really complex, but it's doing something internally, and once it's done, we say that the estimator has been fitted, and now it's ready to generate predictions. And at that point, we can call predict, where we pass it another X matrix, which could be the same one as before, but it could be different, and then it takes that in and it gives us back predicted values. So let's see this in action. That's a little abstract and probably easiest to just illustrate that. If there's an echo, it could be that the room is echoey, so I apologize. There's probably at this point not much I can do about that. I should look into that later. I can try talking more quietly, maybe. Okay, so how do we do this? So let's start by, just as for practical purposes, let's not worry about all 1,440 features. We'll just use 5 of them. And I've set that up here so that you can change this if you want. You can change anything, but certainly if it's in all caps like that, then the suggestion is please feel free to play with that. And what we're going to do here is, remember I said that X all data frame contains 1,440 features. So we're just going to subsample random 5 features. I'm actually fixing the random state just so that we get the same result if you rerun this. If you want to try different randomizations, then just remove this argument and you'll get a different set of features every time. And we already set up the Y's, but we'll do that just to remind you that Y is the age. And we're trying to predict that. Okay, so that's just the data. We haven't touched the estimator. Now let's actually set up our estimator, the thing that's actually going to give us the prediction. And we'll just stick with simple garden variety ordinary least squares regression, which is called linear regression in scikit-learn, and it's housed inside the linear model module, which contains many other linear models as well. Just to kind of show you, you've got things like Bayesian ridge regression, elastic net, gamma regressor. Some of these I don't actually even know what they are. There's just tons and tons of different estimators implemented in the linear model module. But we'll just worry about sort of traditional OOS. And all we have to do to initialize the estimator, so like many things in Python, scikit-learn is at least slightly object-oriented. We need to create an instance of that class. So linear regression is a class, and we're creating an instance of that particular class. And we'll call it model. We'll assign it the variable model, but you can do whatever you want. And we'll execute that cell, and nothing happens, but internally, there is now a variable in memory that points to a linear regression estimator. And we are fine with all the default variables. Notice that by default, linear regression will add an intercept column. So if you are passing in X's that already have an intercept, make sure you turn that off. But that's all there is to it, right? So that's all. Essentially, in one line, we just initialized our regression estimator. And now we're ready to fit our data. And as I mentioned, we do this by calling the fit method. And this is going to be true for every estimator in scikit-learn. We will have a fit method. And we give it X, that's the feature array, and Y, which is the vector of labels. And that's it. We run that, and nothing happens. It returns itself, essentially. We can suppress that with the semicolon there. Nothing happens, but we know that it's now, the model's been trained. It's fitted. Once we have that, I'm actually going to, let me just, I just want to clear the outputs just so that, I mean, you can see them on the hub probably anyway on your side, but just so that there's like some element of surprise here. So once we do that, we can look at the fitted parameters, the parameter estimates after the model's been fitted. And so here, internally, you can find the intercept in this intercept underscore parameter, and the coefficients are here. And so here you have them. Remember, we have 5 variables, right? So there should be an intercept and then 5 slope parameters, the beta coefficients in the traditional representation of the model. Notice that they vary tremendously in size, right? Some of these are much, much larger than the others. that's not because like this one and this one are more important than the others. It's because the features are on different scales. I haven't done any standardization. So, you know, for example, like surface area is going to be measured in millimeters squared. That's probably going to be a bigger value than cortical thickness, right? So that's what you're seeing. And these are randomly selected, so I don't know off the top of my head what these variables are, and it won't matter for our purposes. Okay, now that we have that, we have a fitted model. We could pull out these coefficients, write the regression equation ourselves, and apply it manually, but that would be annoying, unnecessary. Instead, we can just call the predict method, passing in the X data. It's the same X data. So we trained the data on X, and we're using it now to predict values, which is a big no-no, but we'll talk about that. Naively, this seems fine, right? Like, okay, I fitted the model, and now I want to see how well it does, so I feed in the same values, and I'll get a prediction. And we'll save that as Y preg. And you can see that you do, in fact, have these continuous outcomes predicted, and these are predicted ages. Okay, now at this point, one way to get a sense of how well the model does is to just visualize the predicted scores against the true scores. And we're using a library called Seaborn to do that. And we get this nice plot. And I think two things hopefully jump out at you fairly quickly. One is that, yes, indeed, there is some reasonable relationship between these two things. Like there clearly is a positive correlation between the prediction and the actual age. As predicted age goes up, so does true age in general. But the other point to note is like this clearly looks like a nonlinear relationship. Right? It looks like we should have probably some alternative functional form here and not just like a simple linear fit. And we're not going to worry about that here, but again, be aware that like this is not, what I'm showing you is not in any sense an optimal pipeline. Is there a nice way to present results in table format? I will get to that. The answer is not really, because that's not the point of this. You can use other tools to do this, and I'll show you that in a second. That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that because we'll get to that. Okay, so that's just like a sanity check that yes, there is something reasonable is going on, though probably we can do better. And you're welcome to play with this and transform the variables or fit more complex models to try and get better correspondence between these things. But just to kind of underscore how little work we had to do for all this, right? Here's the whole thing in just 3 lines. This is all it took. We initialized the model, we called fit, passing in the data, and then we generated predictions with predict. And in fact, there's also like to shorthand fit predict, or at least there used to be. It might have been removed at some point. I think there's only fit transform now. Well, forget that. But you used to be able to actually fit predict in one shot. Okay, so that's all it takes. And we've done machine learning. We've done supervised machine learning. We've generated predictions with linear regression. Great. Now, this actually addresses the question that just came up. You might at this point, if you're sort of coming from a traditional science background, you might think, great, so we have this model. It seems to do something. We want to see some results. And if you're used to R or also point and click packages, and you're thinking in terms of inference over parameters, then you might want a big dump, a big table that shows you everything that's going on. And we are not going to do that here, but I will show you that you could get that if you wanted using a different package called stats model, which is more analogous to the kind of statistical inferential tools you find in R, for instance. And so this would be the equivalent of like LM and then calling summary on the result, roughly. And so this is maybe what you want to see, right? So there's your R squared, your adjusted R squared, the F stat, the parameter estimates, standard errors, etc. And you're probably used to all this. And you might look at it and say like, oh, well, it looks like, yeah, most of these variables make a statistically significant contribution. And now we can write a paper and say, well, here's how much these matter, etc. You can do that. But we're not going to talk about that at all here. And the reason is because that kind of approach comes out of, remember, like a fundamentally different mindset, right? We're not asking here, what does the data generating process look like? Like, what can we learn about what's going on internally by looking at these parameters? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. That's just not the goal here. The goal is really to try and generate a model that generates the strongest predictions. And looking at this wouldn't help you unless you thought that it's going to lead you to predict or to generate a better estimate, right? And it might, but probably doesn't. Probably there's better ways of coming up with good predictions than spending a lot of time thinking about what exactly the parameter estimates look like. Okay. All right. So we are really going to focus on evaluating just the overall quality of the prediction. So how do we do that? Well, we have an entire module in scikit-learn called metrics, which contains, as the name suggests, metrics. And there's no sort of single right answer here, right? Like, you get to decide what you consider a good prediction, and there's all kinds of quantities you could compute that you think might reflect a better or worse prediction. We will stick with one particularly simple one because it's the default metric in most of the regression estimators, and probably most people are familiar with it, which is the coefficient of determination, or R squared. So we're going to use the R squared metric to quantify how well our prediction, or how well our model is doing, how good are our predictions. And so inside the metrics module, you have a whole bunch of scoring functions, one of which is R2 score. But again, just to show you that there are more, you can see that there's lots and lots and lots of scoring functions you could use. And they all have the same interface. This is the beauty of scikit-learn. Everything tends to be structured around a very simple, clean way of doing things. And so once you know that the way you evaluate performance with R2 score is by passing in the true scores, Y, and then the predicted scores, you'll know that this is how you would do it for essentially any scoring metric that operates on this kind of data. Now, not everything expects regression problems, et cetera, but for most of or many of the metrics in there, you could replace this with something else like, or mean squared error, I think is what it's called. And so that would give you like the MSE, right? So you could very easily swap out different metrics, just like you could swap out different estimators. They all follow the same pattern. So here we're importing the R2 score, we're generating predictions from our fitted model, and then we're computing performance. And it looks like our fitted model, just like you saw in the stats model output here. And it's a good thing that it lines up, right? If it didn't, we would worry about one of these things. But we get the same answer. So we explain 20% of the variation. That's what R squared measures. The portion of variation in the outcomes that we're explaining using the model as a whole. Okay. So is this good or bad? It's a matter of perspective, right? That depends on what your frame of reference is. We don't need to take a stand on that. But at the very least, it's clear that it's non-trivially predicting people's ages from a handful of structural brain features, right? It's certainly doing much better than chance, whatever you think that is. And so as an exercise, you can go back and you can try experimenting with other metrics and also other estimators potentially. I'll note that estimators have a built-in scorer. So we didn't actually have to do this business of importing the R2 score. We could have actually just called score on our fitted estimator, because by default, regression estimators have, all estimators have a scoring function, the supervised ones. And for regression estimators, or many of them at least, the R squared is the default metric. So if we'd just done this, we get exactly the same answer. That's even easier. It's one line less to type. Okay, so that's a regression problem. And we'll talk, we're not gonna be satisfied with this 20% as like a good estimate of how well we're doing. We'll come back to this, but that's sort of the schematic explanation of a regression problem and how you apply scikit-learn to it. Could you please briefly explain why we want R squared instead of squaring correlation coefficient? Yes, there is a good reason, which is that R squared, there are different ways to compute it, but if you compute R squared as the square of the correlation, you're bounding it at 0, and actually, you can have arbitrarily large negative values of R squared. And that implies that you can have a model that is so bad that you would have been better off just predicting you're predicting the mean of the new data as the prediction for all the scores. That would have been better than actually applying the trained model. And in fact, I think I don't know if we'll talk about it. I think, yeah, actually hold that thought. We will get to an example of exactly that, and then we'll clarify exactly why you want this computation of R squared. Though, this is a decision, right? You can say, well, that's fine. I don't care if it's 0. I already know it's crappy. What do I care if it's like minus 1,000? But the R squared definition that's built into scikit-learn does allow negative values to be unbounded. And you can look up the definitions of R squared, et cetera, if you want. Okay, so that's regression. Let's talk about classification. So one thing to notice, and I mention this because in psychology and neuroscience, people do this a lot, and it's a really bad idea, right? In a sense, you can always take any regression problem and turn it into a classification problem. I could have taken age, or age variable in years, and said, okay, everyone above the mean age is old, and everyone below the mean age is young. And now I have a classification problem. It's just a two-class problem, right? The reason I say that's a really, really bad idea is that with rare exception, you are throwing away a lot of information when you do that, right? So you have this continuous distribution of age, and then you come along and basically say, let's take the midpoint of that, and we'll do a median split or some other discretization. And you're losing a lot of information. Just think of the points that are like, just on this side versus just on that side, right? They're totally different classes, even though they might be just like a hair apart. It might be like age 25.2 here and 0.4 there. So it really distorts the outcome. And there's almost never a good reason to actually discretize a continuous variable. If you find yourself doing that, then probably you should come up with you should frame it as a regression problem and try to find an estimator that can predict continuous quantities, right? Because you are almost certainly throwing away information. And this is really common. So I linked to this paper. It's a nice paper that describes this problem. It's super common to see this, but it's a bad idea. Maybe makes it easier to interpret. It's easier to say like, oh, 82% accuracy than to talk about like, well, the root mean squared error is X, but it's generally not worth what you're giving up. Okay, so we could do that, but we're not going to. We have another variable you can use, which is the diagnosis group. So about half of these, there's I think 1,100 scans or 1,000 scans, and roughly half of them are from individuals diagnosed with autism, and the other half are controls. And so we will use that. We're going to use the same brain features, potentially all 1,400 of them, but now we're going to try to predict whether someone has an autism diagnosis or not. Well, notice you could actually make the same argument I just made with respect to like, is it even a good idea to be predicting these discrete diagnoses? But at least that's a thing that exists out there, right? Like psychiatrists do have to make these categorical diagnoses, even if we all think that there aren't really these discrete taxa in the world, and actually there's some dimensional structure there too. But at least we're given these labels, so we'll live with them. Okay. Now, one way to get a sense of how easy or difficult this problem is likely to be is to just like pick 3 variables, and not randomly, I'm actually taking the 3 most strongly correlated variables and try to get a sense of like how strongly they are correlated with the classes. And so what I'm doing here, and this is interactive, and if you're running this on the hub, you should be able to play with this. You can actually just see, so the 3 dimensions are 3 features that are they're among the most strongly correlated features with the class we're trying to predict. And the colors are autism or control. And you're not really going to be able to see a whole lot going on, right? And then these are the most strongly correlated features. I think they correlate 0.15 to 0.2 or something. So this is obviously, like, you shouldn't conclude from this like this is hopeless. Like, there are lots of problems where individual features are not super helpful, but a big model will do fantastically well. But at least this should maybe sort of clue you into maybe this is going to be a fairly difficult problem. Maybe it's not going to be super easy, at least, to predict whether someone is in the autism or control group from these kinds of structural features. But let's try and do a little bit better than that. And so we're going to use a classifier. We'll use something called Gaussian naive Bayes, which is a very simple classifier. It's basically sort of it's called naive because it applies Bayes' theorem under the assumption that all of your features are independent. And of course, they're not independent, right? The features are not independent of one another, conditional on the class. It's not like if you took all the individuals with autism, there's no correlation between their surface area of this ROI and the one right next to it. That would be crazy. But it's a simplifying assumption, and it actually works surprisingly well in lots of different applications, which is why people often use this as sort of a baseline, because it's sort of dumb. It makes really crummy assumptions, but if you can do well with this, then it sets a high bar for like how well you need to be able to do with other methods. So we'll just use Gaussian naive Bayes just to illustrate the mechanics of this. And there's not much to illustrate because it looks just like the regression problem. We initialize, now it's in the naive Bayes module, but we initialize it the same way. We'll use all the default parameters. We're setting the y up now to be our group variable. So this is discrete, remember? And then we fit it. Looks exactly the same. And it's very fast. It's another nice thing about Gaussian naive Bayes, right? No problem at all fitting a model with 1,400 features. Okay, how well did it do? Remember, every supervised estimator has a default score. So if we call score on that, here's what we see, about 63%. Okay, this is not R squared. This is, the default score here is just mean accuracy. So this is to say, if we just look at the class that each of these cases is assigned to, it would be correct about 63% of the time. Is that good or bad? Again, it depends, right? It's better than chance, most likely. But is it good? That depends on what you're expecting. It's clearly not good enough to implement in clinical practice. You cannot send a clinician a brain-based classifier and says, it's a good news. This will classify 63% of your patients correctly, right? That would be kind of disastrous. But this is a really simple thing. We fit in 2 lines. It shouldn't be surprising that we can't do really, really well. It would be kind of remarkable if it were that easy. Okay, and also this metric can be misleading because funny things can happen. Like imagine if 90% of the data set was controls. Then you could get 90% accuracy just by saying everyone is a control, right? So raw accuracy can be quite misleading. And there are lots of different metrics in the metrics module that could help you get a sense of is performance really good or bad. I'll just show you one helpful utility, the classification report. So same thing, we get the predictions and then we feed them in just like any other metric, true scores, predicted scores, and now we get this nice table. And it breaks down overall accuracy into precision and recall. And many of you will be familiar with these. These are just different ways of quantifying performance. Precision is like true positive divided by total positives. Recall is the same as sensitivity. It's the proportion of cases that were correctly detected. And so this gives you a different window into how well the algorithm is doing. And this is the class. This is autism. This is control. And you can see that the estimator seems to be more sensitive. It's in some sense, in one sense at least, better at correctly identifying controls than people with autism. And that's an interesting observation, and I'll leave it to you to think of an explanation for this. And there's probably many, but there's one sort of fairly trivial explanation for why the estimator might be showing this particular difference here. Okay, hopefully I answered that question. How does the accuracy compare to sensitivity? Recall is sensitivity, and the overall accuracy is just includes both true positives and true negatives, whereas recall is just the true positive rate. Okay, all right, so that's supervised learning, just an example of each. Let's do one more thing quickly, and then we'll take a little break. We'll do clustering. So remember, we have this like enormous data set of like 1,440 features, and we have 1,000 observations. And you might say, and people certainly have asked this kind of question before for autism as well as other things, is autism like a monolithic thing? Are there maybe different subtypes that we could identify by clustering? Can we find sort of patterns in those brain features that allow us to assign individuals to like one of different subtypes or clusters of autism? And of course, there are 2 questions here. One, can you do this mechanically? And the answer is, of course, yes. You can do a clustering on that kind of data. There's a separate question to be asked, like, is what you get out sensible? And so let's take the first of these first. So in scikit-learn, there is before we do that, let's scale the data. So I mentioned already that the data runs standardized, but now we are actually going to pre-process the data using this scale function that's provided for us. So there's helpful utilities for pre-processing data in scikit-learn and pre-processing module. And we're also just selecting out only the individuals with autism, right? So we're not going to cluster controls and people with autism. And just for the sake of illustration, you can cluster on as many features as you want, but just to keep things simple, I'm going to do the clustering on 2 features. So I'm just picking 2 features at random for illustration purposes. Obviously, you would want to do something more sophisticated if this was sort of like a real application. So this is just really pulling out the data and pre-processing it and scaling it. And the reason for the scaling is because we're going to be using an estimator called k-means that is sensitive to the scale of the data because it operates in Euclidean space. And so it will really mess things up if like some of our variables are on like, this like gigantic scale and others are like all the variations in this little portion of space. Because the assumption of k-means is that like the parametric variation is the same across all the features. So by putting them all on the same footing, we're essentially saying they're all equally important. If you don't like that assumption, then of course you can scale them in other ways. So, and I won't talk about the details of k-means, although you can certainly read that, except to say that it's an iterative algorithm that's basically trying to find, it's trying to minimize the distance. So you can think of an n-dimensional space of features, and it tries to identify centroids, or like centers of clusters, and then assign observations to those clusters so that the distance between the observations and the centroid is small, and the difference between the centroids and each other is large. Right? So you're maximizing the between cluster variation and minimizing the within subject variation. But mechanically, nothing is new here. We initialized this k-means estimator, which is found in the cluster module, and once again, all kinds of stuff in there. Oops. So you can easily swap out k-means for all kinds of other things. And let's say we want 4 clusters. This is a general problem, right? Is that identifying the optimal number of clusters, to the degree there is such a thing, is a difficult problem. But we're not going to worry about that. We're just going to say, let's see what happens if we have 4 clusters. And we initialize the estimator, and the only argument we give it is the number of clusters. And then we're calling fit and predict in one shot. And notice only one variable is being passed in here, and that's the extracted set of features we want, right? Why is there no y? Because this isn't supervised learning. We don't know the answer. We don't know what the true labels are. Okay, once we fit that model and predicted, we can look at the labels, and here's what we get. So these are now class assignments. So the model is predicting that the first observation is assigned to cluster, this is the 4th cluster, so cluster label 3, 3, 1, 1, etc. Okay, and since we only use 2 features to do our clustering, which is part of the reason why I only did it with 2, we can actually easily visualize the results. So if we plot that, remember we have 4 clusters, then you get something like this. Now, remember what I said earlier, right? This is, I think, really, really deceptive and dangerous, because if you look at it, it's very easy to believe that you're actually seeing like real structure here. And in one sense, of course, there is real structure, right? Like there is, it's obviously the case that like there's some reason why this data point is over here and this one is down here. But there's the fact that this looks super compelling, that you can clearly carve up this 2-dimensional space and assign labels to it. Does that mean we're actually capturing, like there really are 4 subtypes of autism, and now this has implications for prognosis or diagnosis, treatment, etc.? That's a really difficult problem, right? And the problem with almost all clustering algorithms is they don't say no, and they have no way of telling you like this is just not a good problem for you to try to solve. They will give you an answer. The answer will very often look totally sensible. And if you imagine actually taking the average of the observations in these clusters, right, and relating that to some other variable, you may very well find that there are differences between clusters on some other outcome. Does that justify the clustering? No, it just means that you happen to be picking up on structuring the data that's real structure, but may not be anywhere near that simple. So if you think of it as just like a way of reducing complexity, because human beings need to think in small numbers, and that's helpful to us, then great, clustering can be very useful. But if you make the mistake of thinking that this is like some, truth approximation method, and because it looks nice, therefore there are 4 subtypes of autism, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble, right? And so that's just a general concern to be aware of. Let's take just a very short break, just in the interest of time. Sorry, I would like to take a longer one, but we'll just stop for like 2 minutes, just for like a bathroom break, real quick. I'm happy to answer any questions, and then we'll pick up, and I'll tell you why most of what I just said is wrong, at least as far as performance goes. Any questions? Okay, good. Lots of questions. Okay, so I'll just take these 3 and then we'll start up again. Let me start with the shortest one. Should we do normalization before classification? there's no simple answer to that. It depends. So depends on a couple of things. One is the algorithm, the model you're using. Some of them are sensitive to scale, some aren't. So like for linear regression, for instance, I didn't bother because linear regression doesn't care about the scale. So that's one question. If the estimator doesn't care about scale, then there's no reason to standardize. If it does, then you have a different question to ask yourself, which is, in some sense, what's your prior, right? Like just because the estimator is sensitive to scale doesn't mean that you have to feed it completely normalized data. If you have reason to think that like one dimension is more important than another, then maybe you leave it, or maybe you even transform it so that its standard deviation is twice as large, right? So there's no simple answer to that. But you have to think about it, right? Like don't assume that if you don't think about like whether your data is or what scale your data in, it won't matter, because it may very well completely change the answers you get. It's a good question. To arrive at optimal, actually, I won't take that one right now just because I want to move on. So I'll just take the ones that already people posted. How can you validate the result of clustering? Well, actually, I will answer because these two questions are very closely related. I have an opinion that's probably not super popular. I think validating clustering on like real world complex data, like imaging data, is essentially pointless. I think it's better to think about it as like what's useful to you. Right? So think of like, a good example for those of you who do fMRI or connectivity is like the Yao 7 and 17 dimension or network solutions, right, for functional connectivity. Is there anything special about 7 or 17? No, there isn't. You could have picked 8, it would have been probably just as good. But it's, practically speaking, it's helpful to have like a solution that's fairly low dimensional, like 7, and another one like 17. And I think that authors, like, I think Thomas even made that point in the paper, right? There's no, like, it's not realistic to think that there's ground truth. One fairly trivial reason why is because think about the assumption you're making, right? It's that like every voxel can be assigned to one and only one cluster, which is completely crazy if you think about like neurons being like, interdigitated with other neurons. There's no way that this voxel can only be doing this one thing. So you have to look at it as a simplifying assumption, I think. That said, if you don't want to look at it that way, there are ways to validate clustering algorithms, and they're generally some flavor of do the clustering for many different values of k, or different numbers, and then there's all kinds of metrics, and many of them are in the metrics library module in scikit-learn that will give you a score. And so there's things like the silhouette score, which will give you a quantitative sense of like, how much are you optimizing the between cluster versus within cluster variance at k equals 4 versus k equals 15, and then you can make a decision that way. And I think that's totally fine to do that. To just like I would say, don't fool yourself into thinking that because the metric gives you the best value for k equals 7, that's like somehow like some insight into reality, right? Probably the true structure is still super high dimensional, and these are all just approximations. Okay, so let me close those questions. There's a question here about like, how do you moderate what's the best way to test whether the association of some neural function with some outcomes is moderated by individual difference variable? I would say I probably will not answer that. Sorry, just because that to me is more of a sort of inference question, right? It's if you think of it as like, can you improve the prediction by adding individual differences moderators? Then fair enough, you could just add them like any other variable, and you might want then a model that can handle interactions like random forest or something that will introduce nonlinearities for you, or you could compute the interaction terms and add them as predictors. But there's nothing like terribly special about the fact that they're individual differences variables, because you're not trying to do like any kind of understanding in this kind of framework. Okay, all right, let me move on. Those are great questions. All right, so what we've seen here so far is like 3 examples of really fully operational machine learning workflows in scikit-learn, right? Regression, classification, clustering. I won't do dimensionality reduction, but there is an example in the last notebook, so a detailed one, so you can take a look at that later. And thanks to scikit-learn, this is super easy. In like pretty much 2 to 3 lines of code, we can fit predictive models that seem to do, or clustering models that seem to do something interesting. So maybe we should stop there, right? Like maybe we should stop and like go and publish a paper that says we can explain 20% of the variance in age, and job well done, right? Give ourselves a pat on the back. You might also think, well, okay, not so fast. We did okay with 5 features. Oh yeah, thinking about the regression model in this case, but we had 1,440 of them. Like, why would we think that a prediction based on 5 predictors is the best we can do? Maybe we should try throwing some more of these predictions in there, these features in there. And so you could go back all the way up and change that n features value to something larger and play with that. But I will save you the trip, and we'll just do that here. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take different sizes of randomly selected features from subsets of that 1440, and then we'll just fit the same linear regression model. We'll start running this because it'll take a little while. And then we'll just plot the results. So we'll just look at the R-squared and how that varies as a function of the number of features, the number of predictors. And this is just linear regression, right? So we could do this with any other model as well. So it's running. It's actually taking, I guess it takes a little longer on the hub than on my laptop. I'm also doing this 10 times for each feature size, just so we get a slightly stabler estimate of R-squared. Now this is taking longer than it should be. Well, okay, I'll tell you what you're going to see in a moment. What you will see is that, in fact, as we increase the number of features, as you might expect, intuitively, things do get better and better. And in fact, by the time I think we get up to like 500 or 1,000 features, we are explaining all the variance. There we go. Okay, so yeah, by like 1,000 features, R-squared is 1.0. So we're doing perfectly, right? So we have explained all of the variance in age using 1,000 brain features extracted with FreeSurfer. That's amazing. Like, maybe we should go and publish a paper because we've solved the problem. We can perfectly predict age from fairly coarse measures of brain structure. I hope you sort of immediately have alarm bells going off in your head when I say that. When you look at something like this, it should really seem too good to be true, right? And it has to be, if for no other reason than like clearly age cannot possibly be measured perfectly, right? So like, just like trivially, somebody made a typo somewhere, someone doesn't know their exact age, there's got to be errors in the data set. And so it's not possible to be predicting 100% of the variance because there's a noise ceiling, right? You cannot predict error, and there has to be error certainly in the age variable, but also for sure in the brain structure data, right? Like some scans are probably really bad quality. There's like weird distortions in people's brains. FreeSurfer is great, but it's not perfect. And so it would be crazy to think that this is actually a real result. So what's happening, right? Like what is going wrong that it looks like we do better and better with this really dumb linear regression model as we start piling in more features, even though we know rationally that this cannot possibly be true, right? Something must be going very wrong. What is the problem here? Let me answer a couple quick questions. Do you have the option to add regularization? Yes, you do, for sure. Take a look at the 5th notebook there. There's like just like a million different flavors of penalized regression. Not really a million, maybe like 6. I won't touch on them just because they have no time, which is unfortunate, but do read that notebook and we'll hopefully answer your questions. Can using fit make the instance forget the data? You can rerun fit, so you can learn from new data sets as you like, and you can certainly reinitialize the estimator, so you can make it forget that way, right? You can just reinitialize it, and then it's like it's never seen any data. If that answers the question. Okay. All right. So what's happening here? Well, what we're seeing is something known as overfitting, which is a central, and in many ways, the central problem. And in some ways, this is probably, I mean, this is a bit of a caricature, but you could say that in some ways, the whole field of machine learning kind of exists to solve the problem of overfitting and also underfitting, right? So that the goal is you want to get the best possible prediction, but you want to avoid basically hallucinating. You want your estimator not to hallucinate patterns in the data. And if that seems weird to you, like, what do you mean? How could like a statistical model hallucinate? Then that's what the next notebook in the series, which you can open now, Overfitting, will tell us all about. Okay, so we'll pick up exactly where we left off. We have this model. It seems to do incredibly well, so well that we're sure something must be wrong, right? It's lying to us in some way. We're not sure why, but something is going wrong here. So again, we'll start by importing all the stuff we've seen before, and here I wrote a little function that samples data you don't need to worry about it. Just will save time because we're going to repeatedly sample data. And for this little notebook, I'm leaving aside the imaging data just because I think it's easier to make the point. It's just simulated data where we know the ground truth. So let's start by just sampling from a quadratic function. Right? So this is a curvilinear function, which you can see, right? You can sort of see even to the eye, like this is what the true function looks like. But we're just sampling 30 data points and plotting them. Now, if you come along and try to fit this with a linear regression, like we've been doing, you're going to get something like this. Okay. Obviously, you look at this and to the eye, this is not right? It's clearly the line is not capturing the actual relationship you see. Why? Well, it can't, because there's curvature in the actual true function, and a linear regression can only do this, right? It can't curve, it can't bend. So we can say that the linear regression model is underfitting the data. It's clearly missing out. It's failing to capture some clear, important pattern in the data. And the problem is it's not flexible enough, right? We kind of want it to bend, but linear regression cannot bend. So what do? Well, we can fix that by using a slightly more flexible estimator, and we'll do polynomial regression, which is actually still linear regression. It's just that the features now we have polynomial features. So actually, we can just take this x value, square it, and now we can capture quadratic trends if we feed that to linear regression. So we could do that. We could stop at like the linear term and the quadratic term, but maybe we think like, why stop there? Like for all we know, there's more nuance that we're not seeing. Let's go for broke. Let's go for like a 10th degree polynomial. Let's put in like 10 features that capture trends all the way up to the 10th order polynomial. So we do that, right? So and scikit-learn has a really nice abstraction for this, or that can help us at least, called the pipeline. So a pipeline lets you build up an estimator out of discrete steps. And because every estimator in scikit-learn, or in every transformer, which we didn't talk about, but similar principle, expects the same inputs, and it takes in inputs in the same format and produces outputs in the same format, we can actually stack these very predictably. So what we're going to do here is, inside this function, I'm just creating a pipeline that's composed of 2 steps. The first step is this pre-processing step called polynomial features, which does what I just described. It takes that variable, and it just takes it to the power of 2 to the power of 3, 4, and it gives us back all those features as our new X array. And then we feed that into the linear regression. And so the nice thing is we can write this little function where with one parameter, we control how complex that polynomial regression is. And so now we say, okay, let's initialize this with the 10th degree polynomial, and we'll fit it to the same data. And here's what we see. Notice that the mean squared error in this case, or metric of performance, has gone down considerably, right? It's the same data, and we're doing much better. So this, in some sense, looks like a better model. However, you might just looking at this think like, no, this is no good, right? Like yes, it's bending to capture the data points, but it's bending in a way that clearly it doesn't respect the actual truth in the population, right? In this particular sample, you notice there's a gap between this point and this one. But if we'd sampled a different set of observations, we might have got a point here. And then this solution we see here would be really terrible. And we can test that intuition by doing exactly that. So if we sample some more data from the same ground truth, we can see that sure enough, the error has gone way up. And here's a data point that is, again, drawn from the same ground truth distribution. So it's not like this is like the model should still be doing a good job if it was a good model, but it's not. And that's bad. Why? Well, the model is overfitting. What's happening is we've given it too much flexibility, right? There's not much data, and the model is very flexible. And so it's just trying to reduce error the best way it can, which is it's trying to capture any sort of pattern it sees in that data, even if that requires it to contort itself in really unnatural ways that can't possibly be what is actually going on. And so it is possible to have a model that is too flexible, too clever, right? It has too many parameters, and there's not enough data to prevent it from hallucinating, essentially. So I think it's helpful to actually think of what models are doing in this case as really being analogous to human beings hallucinating, right? Typically, when you hallucinate, there is some stimulus, there's some input in the environment that it's not like completely random and came out of nowhere. It's just that you're reading too much into that pattern. And it's the same here. the model has no way to separate signal from noise beyond the data it's handed. And if you give it too much flexibility, it will conclude that it's found all these little very nuanced patterns in the data, but they're not real. If you sample a new set of observations, you will not get the same answer. So that's what overfitting is. What is the correct or the optimal approach here? Well, if we knew that the ground truth was that there's a quadratic term but no more, then we would do that. We would just say, please make a pipeline and only use a second order polynomial. And then that fits quite nicely. Notice the error here is almost as small as it is up here, but this clearly is going to generalize better. Right? If you get new data, this will probably continue to fit it pretty well. Okay, so that's good. Okay, we only have 10 minutes left. So I got through most of what I expected to get through. What I did was create this little interactive widget here. And so if you run that, this is just a nice way to build intuitions about overfitting. Right? So what you can do here is you can vary the amount of noise in the data, how flexible the model is, and on the left you have sort of the fit in the training sample, and on the right it shows you how well you do in the test sample. And unfortunately, I don't really have time to talk about solutions. So in just like the last 5 minutes, what I will do is just tell you what's in those other remaining notebooks, and so how they discuss this problem. Right? But so hopefully you can get the sense that like machine learning and generating good predictions is not quite as easy as just throwing a bunch of data into an estimator and letting it loose, because it will, if you have enough flexibility in the model, it is pretty much guaranteed to give you an answer that's better than the truth. And the principle here is, what really this boils down to is, you should not really evaluate your model's performance on the same sample that you use to train it. Right? That is sort of like the cardinal sin, as they say in machine learning. You don't train and test the data, don't train and test the model on the same data. And so a lot of machine learning in some sense is like, how do you solve that problem? How do you avoid underfitting without avoiding overfitting? How do you balance flexibility against stability? Right? How do you find that optimal point where you're capturing all the signal, but not reading into the noise? And so the remaining notebooks come at each of those problems from a different perspective. In this fourth one, we discussed cross-validation, which is super important. I'm not saying you have to read this notebook, but definitely if you haven't encountered cross-validation before, do look it up, because, and that's true not just for machine learning. I mean, I think pretty much any regression model in a scientific paper, in my view, should be cross-validated. But cross-validation is just a way of reducing the chance we'll fool ourselves. And so what you do is in some ways, you're just splitting your data in two, using part of it to train the model, and then using the rest of it to evaluate performance. And that way you avoid overfitting. You get a better estimate of how well your model is generalizing to new data. So that will walk you through different cross-validation approaches, k-folds being the dominant one that's super easy and is almost free. There's almost no cost to cross-validation. For people who are interested in sort of what implications this has for inference, I do talk about the fact that machine learning does not generally solve the interpretation problem. Nothing generally solves the interpretation problem. Right? You have to assume a causal model generally. And so I talk about how you can convince yourself that a model is doing well even with cross-validation, but actually potentially there's a big confound here, which is research site. I don't think it's actually a big confound, but it looks like it. So I quickly read a little bit. And then I show you some utilities in scikit-learn for getting a better understanding of how the model is performing, learning curves and validation curves. So those are basically ways of learning more about your data and understanding whether you're overfitting. In the fifth notebook here, model selection, I discuss how you actually select a better estimator, right? So nothing says you should stick with linear regression. And so I talk about something called the bias variance trade-off, why bias is actually a good thing in many cases. You actually want to introduce bias. And I talk about, so this came up as a question, talk a little bit about penalized regression and how you regularize. Essentially, you're introducing prior information to the problem. You're constraining your estimator to do certain things because you think that it matches up well with the underlying reality in the data. And so this shows you a variety of ways you can do that in scikit-learn. Although this is all still scratching the surface, I talk a little bit about random forest here as an example of a very different kind of algorithm. And then lastly, the last notebook talks about dimensionality reduction. and particularly PCA, which is by far the most common dimensionality reduction method, and just shows you that you can actually mitigate a lot of overfitting by reducing the number of features in your data if you start from a position where you have a lot of features and not so much data. So this is, again, just a very, very, very preliminary overview, but hopefully you at least get the sense that setting aside, like, there are nuances, of course, there are all kinds of complexities in doing, well, any kind of statistical inference and certainly machine learning, but mechanically at least, you should feel pretty good about the fact that it's actually really easy to get an answer out of scikit-learn. That's not to say you should trust the first answer you get, but it is a really elegant, well-developed, well-designed, well-documented package that makes it really easy to do machine learning on all kinds of problems. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of flavor of machine learning. And sorry, I muted myself. Several of the talks the rest of the week will sort of feature much more sophisticated applications to different kinds of imaging data. I will answer these questions right now. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, I can't, because I need to actually go in and set up the next talks. Sorry, if I didn't get to your question, feel free to ask on Slack, and I will answer. Oh, I will answer quickly. You will have access to the notebooks indefinitely because they'll be on GitHub forever, basically. But the Jupyter Hub will go down, I think, on Saturday. So you'll just have that. All that means is you'll have to, like, download them locally and run them on your own computer. But the actual notebooks are not going anywhere. And the last question I wish I could take, but just in interest of time, I can't. So do ask me that in the Slack, and I'll give you an answer. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed that.